Hey guys, welcome to another installment of The Great Divorce. Today we'll be focusing on Chapter 9. The main things that we'll be talking about today is C.S. Lewis's guide, George MacDonald, and the significance of choice. So, first off, George MacDonald. Who is he and what function does he play in this? So George MacDonald was a great influence intellectually to C.S. Lewis, as we can tell simply by reading the novel. He mentions, hey, you've been inspiring me when I first read your books called The Fantasies when I was 16. It woke my interest up to fantasy and the writings and the arts. And he mentions that George MacDonald is a guide to him just as Beatrice was to Dante. What is that really functioning as? Well, we would have to know a little bit about the Divine Comedy by Dante. What we have is Dante in the first two books, Inferno and Purgatory, has a guide of Virgil. It is only until he goes to Paradiso that Beatrice becomes his guide. The significance of that is Beatrice was this heavenly symbol for Dante. It was this ultimate love and knowledge. So how does that translate to the Great Divorce? Well, George MacDonald's function as this unbiased representation of what the heavenly realm is and kind of the theology that goes behind it. Up until this point, C.S. Lewis is just figuring out things about the heavenly realm purely by observation and by other ghosts. That can obviously be contrasted to George MacDonald because of bias and unbiased opinion. So, that is George MacDonald, and what we'll see throughout the rest of the novel is George MacDonald plays a very key role in kind of explaining some philosophical views. One could say Lewis isn't necessarily saying these are the views of George MacDonald, but rather he uses this authoritative voice to give his own personal theological views on the matter. So, the second point, the importance of choice. What we have is George MacDonald first explains kind of how this whole dynamic of heaven and hell work. However, he doesn't necessarily choose the words heaven and hell precisely. He uses it kind of as shorthand throughout parts of the novel and further later on in the book. But it's used as a shorthand for a more theological concept that George MacDonald explains. Well, first he says that the ghosts are able to come up here because of refrigerum. What does that mean? It means that in some older doctrine and thoughts that the person in hell could explore the different realms. They could visit heaven or they could visit earth. They were kind of given holidays or vacations. So George MacDonald adopts this. Remember, we have to note that C.S. Lewis does not say that this is his own personal doctrine. He's using it as an allegory, which we'll talk about a little later in this video. So he mentions the refrigerum. He then goes and explains that hell and different parts of heaven shouldn't necessarily be referred to as hell or heaven or whatever, because it's rather different stages. He goes, for the ghost that appears in the shadowy realm in the beginning, but chooses to grow in the heavenly realm, can more adopt it as the valley of shadow, and goes, but they can grow. It does not have to be their resting place. And he also says, those who appear in the heavenly realm at the beginning, we shouldn't necessarily call it heaven necessarily, but rather we should consider it the valley of the shadow of life, representing almost this purgatory state. He mentions that the outer banks of heaven are not necessarily the true heaven. It gives you a glimpse, just like the hell realm kind of gives you a glimpse of it. He mentions that this is not a stagnant place necessarily unless you choose it to be. Now, again, that's not necessarily C.S. Lewis's doctrine. He's not saying that he's not confirming nor denying the existence of a purgatory, nor is he really saying that you can transfer from hell to heaven. And that's what's significant about this chapter. So now let's get a little bit into the doctrine that George MacDonald uses through C.S. Lewis's voice. So the first thing that we have to mention is the idea of divine choice or divine given choice, meaning God allows us to choose one way or the other. We had mentioned this in previous chapters, but this time it's stated a little more explicitly. So I'm going to read a passage real quick. It says, "But what of the poor ghosts who never get onto the omnibus at all?" Remember the bus being to go to the heavenly realm. And George MacDonald replies, "Everyone who wishes does. Never fear. There are only two kinds of people in the end. Those who say to God, 'Thy will be done,' and those to whom God says, in the end, 'Thy will be done.' All that are in hell choose it. Without that self-choice, there could be no hell. No soul that seriously and constantly desires joy will ever miss it. Those who seek, find. To those who knock, it is open." So what is C.S. Lewis doing in this little interaction? Well, first, he mentions that anyone who chooses will be there. Anyone who wants to be on the bus is there. And it goes down into two mind states or worldview. Those who submit to God and say, "Your will be done," or God saying to the individual, "Your will be done." So we see what he's saying here is that God allows for free will and choice. What does that mean? It means that he's saying to the individual, you can choose to do what you want. I want you to make the choice to follow my will. But if you choose not to, I'm going to give it to you. And that choice is what is truly hell. He later goes on to say that hell is almost a mind state, but heaven is not. What could that metaphor mean? Knowing from basically this entire allegory of a true reality, what C.S. Lewis is trying to say here is that through Christ and God, we can find true life, a life that is not transparent, the allegory of the ghost, or a life that is just a mirage of true reality or temporality. He then says that all that are in hell choose it. This is also a comment on the problem of pain, or the idea of how could a loving God cast people into hell. C.S. Lewis is playing off this apologetic approach and going, no, it's not God casting people into hell. It's God giving people what they want. And what they want is not him. And the whole idea of hell, the whole realm, the whole concept is a realm or a place without God. So he's saying God does not cast people into hell, but rather through his love allows people to go to hell. He allows them to go into a place of the opposite of his will. Now, why is that significant? It's a theological concept, but what we want to do here is we want to take that allegory and that theological concept and try to figure out what C.S. Lewis is trying to say. He already mentioned that he doesn't believe necessarily in this transference of going from hell to heaven, but rather maybe he's making a commentary on life. Rather, a person can choose to live in their will. As it says, God says to them, "Thy will be done." They're allowed to do the choices they make, and those choices hurt you. Those choices cause you pain, and because he loves you, gives you the choice for you to cause yourself pain. Now, in the inverse of that, what God is allowing is saying, I gave you a way to live that will cause less pain in the truest form. Although it may seem like temporal pain or temporal restraint, through restraint you find the most freedom. And that's the beautiful concept of this allegory, is these ghosts are given the chance to restrain and understand and choose true reality. But as we've seen at this point so far, none of them have. So that's the concept that C.S. Lewis is playing with, is the divine choice to give up oneself. Because to give up oneself is to find true joy. Those who seek will find, to those who knock it will be open. C.S. Lewis is quoting a passage of scripture. So, what is the remainder of chapter 9? Based off of that theological construct, we have characters, we have ghosts. And the first one is a grumbler. Now, C.S. Lewis is mentioning in this with the grumbler that you can't hear anything, or you can't see anything, you can just hear. And George MacDonald goes, well, is she a grumbler or is she just a grumble? Meaning, so focused on oneself's grumbles or discontents that it no longer is a person who is not content, but rather their existence is discontent, to the point where they don't exist at all. They don't have a personal existence. And they mention the unicorn metaphor in the last chapter, where we kind of left off, like, why are unicorns running and people scared? Maybe this is a message to C.S. Lewis that pain and waking upness of life can initiate a spark that brings someone from a grumble back to at least a grumbler. Because if someone is there, there's, as George MacDonald mentions in the story, if something as small as a spark is there, change can happen. So that's the first instance. Then we get to a character that is almost this seductive character, and it mentions almost as if a decaying body was trying to put lipstick on their gums and seduce the living. It's showing the complete absurdity of life, where you try to find it attractive and try to seduce people from a different lifestyle that are seeing it as absurd because they see the trueness of what's being done. It's representing lust in this situation, where at one point maybe that was tempting, but when one experiences true reality, the temptations become absurd. Not saying we do not be tempted, and not saying that we don't fall into temptation, but rather when in contact with true joy, true happiness, true faith, the temptation is absurd. We see it as a decaying body trying to seduce. And then lastly, we have a situation with another ghost. And in this, we have the artist. Now, the engagement between the ghost artist and the artist that we can assume, or the spirit that we can assume is an artist, is their mention of, wow, it's so beautiful here, I want to paint. And he goes, well, first you have to look. And he goes, I have looked. It's beautiful, I want to paint now. And they go into this idea of what is the point of art? And he mentions, well, we painted on earth to show the glimpse of heaven that was given to us. But now that we're in this heavenly realm, why paint at all? Because everything is still there. And it eventually comes down to reputation, because I want to show people what I can do. And he mentions, well, reputation has no purpose here. Everyone is the same. And he goes, well, have you met Claude? That's referencing Monet. And he goes, I haven't. Maybe they're here. I don't really know. And he's like, but they're kind of big figures. How would you not know if they're here? And he goes, well, there is no fame here. There is no authority here in terms of a pecking order of spirits. It's simply just people on an even playing field. And the ghost doesn't like that. He goes, but what about reputation? I worked so hard for this. And he goes, in this state, everyone is the same, and that's what makes it so beautiful. Sure, you can paint at one point, maybe, but first you have to recognize why you're painting. Is it because it's beautiful and it consumes you, or is it because you like the reputation and the recognition of what you can do? You replace the object of admiration for the act. At one point you saw the beauty and it consumed you, so you painted it. Now you paint so that you can get recognition. And then the ghost rejects it and goes away. Because it's better to reign in hell than it is to serve in heaven, in that mentality. It's better to have a false sense of recognition in a state of misery than it is to give up oneself and serve in pure happiness and joy. It's the choice that C.S. Lewis is talking about. You can choose one or the other, and hell does not exist without the choice to choose it. C.S. Lewis's theology is hell was established because people wanted it, because humanity wanted it. They wanted a place where they could be their own control. So hell was not a place of damnation to the point of, oh, you're evil, but rather giving them the choice to be fully them and reject pure joy and happiness. And therefore that is evil. Evil is the choice and rejection of the perfected reality. And heaven is living in that pure reality. And that's where the chapter ends. So at this point, we will continue on in the novel, and see where this goes. C.S. Lewis learning more, see if a ghost does eventually change. So with that, have a great day, and I'll see you next week.